So the number one reason that 3D prints fail is because the bed is not properly leveled. And if you're like me, you're getting sick of going around and manually leveling the bed before each print. In this video, I'm going to be showing you how to install the Creality CR Touch Auto Leveling Kit on an Ender 3 V2 so that you never have to manually level the bed again and you get a perfect first layer on every single print. Now this is actually part of a video series where I'm going to be doing several upgrades to the 3D printer. So if you're into 3D printing, then make sure to check out some of my other videos. And at the end of the video, if you find any value in it, then please consider subscribing and liking. So without further ado, let's get started. All right, so first I wanted to explain how the CR Touch auto leveling works. So traditionally, if you wanted to level your printer, you would move to each corner and you would spin the dials in each corner until the paper has just a little bit of friction. Then you'd move over to the back corner, move the nozzle over, and so forth until you have the bed nice and level before you start your print. Now, the way that the Creality CR Touch works is this sensor gets mounted right here on the nozzle, the print head, and the sensor will, before each print, touch off on various points on the print bed. And this will basically create a map of the surface so it knows exactly how level the bed is with measurements. Then, during each layer of the print, the Z-axis will automatically move up and down to make sure that each layer is printed perfectly flat and perfectly level. Okay, so now let's take a look and see what comes inside of the kit. Okay, we've got at the top a manual, and then we can see on the right side here we've got a bracket. And take the foam out. We can see that there's another bracket and a third bracket. So depending on which version of the Creality Ender printers you have, you're going to use a different bracket. But we're going to be using the one specifically for the Ender 3 V2. And then you can see here, this is the sensor itself. And this is going to be mounting with the bracket somewhere right around here on the print head. Now let's see, is there anything else in the box? We've got just a card here. We've got our cabling. And we've got some hardware, some other hardware, and looks like they've given us a few zip ties. So that's everything that comes in the box. Going through the different brackets, so this is the bracket that goes with the Ender 3 Max. This bracket here can be used for the Ender 3, Ender 3S, the CR10, the Ender 3 Pro, and the Ender 3 5, 5S, and 5 Pro. And then the bracket that we're going to be using for this installation is this one here, which is for the Ender 3 V2. Okay, so for the first step, we're actually going to be mounting the sensor to our print head. And to do that, we're going to first start off by mounting the sensor like this. So you can see those two screws will line up. And then there's a cutaway so that you have room for the connector for the cabling. And to do that, we're going to use these screws here. It actually has it labeled here. I'm not sure if you could see in the video, but on the bag it says M3x6. And then we're also just going to use an M3 hex wrench that we get from the toolkit that comes with our 3D printer. And one thing to note here is that the screws actually get installed from the underside. So we're just going to put that in there, line it up, tighten that down. I'll keep it a little bit loose. Okay, there we go. So the first step is that we have the bracket mounted onto the sensor itself. Okay, and now for the second step, we're going to be using the M3x8 screws and fixing the entire sensor right here. Okay, I'm just gonna make sure it's nice and snug. And there we go. Okay, so that's actually it for the mechanical part of the installation. And now we'll move on to the electrical part. So the electrical part, we're gonna have to connect a cable from right here on the sensor. We're actually gonna route it through this black cable routing tube, and we're gonna feed it in to the machine where we have our motherboard and make the connection there. Now, one thing to note is because we're using the automatic bed leveling sensor for the Z, we're no longer going to need this sensor right here, which is the limit switch end stop for the Z. So when we go to make the connection for the CR Touch, we're actually going to disconnect the Z limit switch end stop. So the next thing I'm going to do is just snip these zip ties so that we can route our cabling through here. In this next step, I'd recommend taking out the drawer with all your tools and also disconnecting your printer from power. And that's because we're going to actually need to flip the printer over in order to access the panel where we have our motherboard. Okay, so this is the panel that we're going to remove, and there's, you can see 3 screws here, 1, 2, 3. Okay, so I guess I didn't realize, but there's actually another screw on this side that needs to get removed as well. So this is kind of on the top of the printer. So we're going to remove this one as well. There we go. And we'll swing back around to the other side here. Now this plate should come right off. Okay, so now we're looking at the motherboard and the electrical connections to it. So essentially what we're going to be doing is, if you look underneath this rainbow ribbon cable, you'll see right here that there's an open connector port, and it's actually labeled to the left of it. You could see it says BLT, so that's actually for either the BL Touch, or in our case, we're using the CR Touch. So we're actually going to be connecting here. But first what we're going to do is disconnect the Z limit switch, which is connected right here. So if you look on the board itself, I'm not sure if you can see in the video, but it actually says X, Y, Z, and that's the one we're going to be disconnecting. And there we go. So now we've made our disconnection here. And now we're going to want to actually remove this cabling. So the cabling actually routes up this way, but the easiest way it's going to be to disconnect it is actually by removing the 2 screws you can see right here. So we're going to come in with a larger hex wrench. Okay, so I'll try my best here to get this on video, but essentially there should be a little slot here that you can squeeze it by. So if I spin the printer around, you can see that we're now able to pull this wire through. And there we go. Now we're disconnected. And while we're already in this kind of general vicinity, I'm going to go ahead and remove these 2 screws, and that'll completely remove our Z limit switch, and then we can move on to the next step. Okay, those are loosened, and there we go. Now we can come back over here and remount these 2 screws. Okay, great. So now we're going to take the cable that came with the CR Touch. So there's 2 ends. The smaller end connects to the CR Touch sensor, and then the larger end, this is the end that's going to connect right here on the motherboard. So if you look at the actual connector here, we're going to want this side facing upwards when we go to make the connection.
make sure it's pushed in all the way. And there we go. So in order to make the cable routing nice and clean, we're going to use the same black cable routing tube here that already comes as is, and we're just going to cut these zip ties. There's a couple more, so there's one right there, and then if we look over here, there's another one. Remove those, and we're going to feed the cable through this existing tubing. So what you're going to want to do is slide the larger sleeve back, and then you'll find this smaller sleeve here. That's the one we're going to want to route through, because that's the one that goes all the way to our nozzle. So you can kind of just feed it through all the way. So you can see here, I've gotten the cable about halfway through the routing, and I cut a little just hole in the plastic sleeve. That way I can pull the cable through, and then I'll kind of do the second half of it in another pass, just because it's a really long length that you need to route it through. So here we go, got that tight, and we're good on this end. Okay, so now we can go ahead and button up our cable routing a little bit. I'm just going to put zip tie here. Now we can come in and put this back plate back into position. So one thing to note are these two have a lock washer, and then the one that goes in the back here is slightly longer and it doesn't have a lock washer. Okay, perfect. And make sure not to forget here, we've got our fourth screw that goes right on the top. So I'm going to go ahead and cut, there's one more zip tie right here. And the reality is there's not really any simple way to do this. You just kind of have to feed it through as best as you can. Like I said, you could see here I kind of made a slit, which helps a little bit to feed it kind of halfway through. And we can actually slide some of this cabling back to get the very end here. And there we go. So let's pull that through the rest of the way. All right, so that process is definitely a little bit painful, but now we're in good shape here. You can use a hex wrench or something to help press that in and make our connection on the sensor. And one thing to note is you probably don't want this part of the wire to be too long and hanging out, so you could pull on the other side of it if you need to let some of the slack in. And we can go ahead and re-zip tie it right here. And just adding another zip tie, this location right over here. Okay, so that's essentially all the steps that you need on the mechanical and electrical side. The next thing I'm going to do is walk you through how to update the firmware and also adjust the setting in your slicer so that the CR Touch will work properly.
Okay, so now I'm going to walk you through the process of updating the firmware. So I'm here on the Creality website, and I'll leave a link to this in the description below. But essentially, you're going to go to Accessory Firmware, and then we're going to scroll up here. So we have CR Touch firmware for 32-bit motherboard. So I'm going to click on that. And then you're going to want to find whatever 3D printer that you have that you're installing it on. In this case, we're going to be installing it on an Ender 3 V2. So we'll download that zip file. So then after you have the zip file, you're just going to extract that, and you're going to get a folder like this. So you're going to want to select whichever main board you have. That's actually printed on the circuit board itself, but you can also just look that up online. So in our case, we have a 4.2.2 main board. And then here we're going to select non-adapter board firmware because we do not have the filament sensor. So we're going to go there. And then this is going to be the file that we want to extract. So the next thing you're going to want to do is take the SD card out of your 3D printer and plug it into your computer. And you're going to want to make sure that there's nothing on that SD card. So you want it to be completely blank for this next step. Then we're going to take this .bin file and we're going to copy it and paste it into the SD card for your 3D printer here. And now we can eject the SD card, and then I'll walk you through the next steps on the printer.
Okay, so now that we've put the firmware onto our micro SD card, we're just going to plug it into our printer. And now we can power the printer on. So when your printer finally turns on, it should automatically install the firmware onto your printer. One way to confirm that the firmware has been updated successfully, you'll see right here, it'll say level. This is a new option that wasn't there before. But anyway, so we're going to move on. We're going to select prepare, and we're going to select auto home. And you can see that the nozzle is moving down. The CR Touch is now sensing to detect the Z. Next, we're going to go up to move. We're going to say move Z. Right now it's at 10, and we're going to slowly bring this down until the nozzle is just above the bed. And we can, for this step, we're going to have to use a piece of paper, but we're only going to have to do this once. Okay, so it looks like minus 1.3 gets us pretty close. So we're going to click OK, and go to back. We're going to disable the stepper and now go through the manual process of leveling the bed just to get us in the ballpark and get us close. This is something that is helpful so that in the future, when you're running auto bed leveling, there won't need to be as many Z variations as it's printing if you get it as close as possible from the start. Now we're going to come back here. Once again, we're going to auto home. Okay, great. And now we're going to use that same offset value that we had input before, and we're going to set our Z offset here to be minus 1.3.
So we're going to be using this as a test print. It's called Bed Level Stripes Test. It's thing 51745552 in Thingiverse, and I'll leave a link to that in the description below, but we're going to be using that as our test print. Okay, so we're here in Cura now, and one thing we're going to need to do is tell the printer to initiate the auto bed leveling. So to do that, we wanted to do it before every single print. So we're going to go to Settings, Printer, and then Manage Printers. And then you're going to select your printer and go to Machine Settings. So in Machine Settings, you're going to scroll down in the Start G-Code section. And after it says G28, which is the homing sequence, we're going to add a G29. And this is going to be our auto bed level sequence. And all you're going to do is hit close, close, and now we can go ahead and slice our model here and save it to our disk. Now we're ready to export it and put it on the printer.
Okay, so we're back at the printer and we've got our SD card inserted into the printer with our test print. So we're going to go back and go to print and print the model, and let's see how it works. Okay, so let's take a look. So this is the test print, and as you can see, it looks like the first layer went down just about perfectly, which tells me that the CR Touch is working great. and we did everything correct in the setup.
Alright, so as you can see, overall the process really isn't that bad to install the CR Touch, and I'm really happy I did so because I know it's going to save me time and hassle in the future from having to re-level the bed after every print and potentially have failed prints. Now, if you still have any questions or comments, then leave those in the comment section below, and if you're new to the channel, then please consider subscribing. If you found any value, give it a thumbs up, and thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.